Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today I'd like to speak about luxury watches under £5,000. And the reason why I'd like to speak about this category is because I'm often asked about interesting and alternative options to the conventional suggestions of Omegas, Rolexes, Breitlings, and the larger brands. And where I speak about luxury watches, I do mean watches which still retain a certain lustre and elegance and design which is certainly in many ways very luxurious, I suppose by definition, because of the beauty of its finishing and the detail of its craftsmanship, but nonetheless retains a versatile build and is designed to be good value, but also quite different to the rest of the pack. And so in this video I'd like to go through 5 quite interesting alternative options for those who want something different, but something still luxurious under £5,000. The first piece I'd like to speak about is a piece from Zodiac. And Zodiac is quite an old brand in terms of its involvement with dive watches, because they produced arguably the first dive watch as it came out the same year as the famous Blancpain 50 Fathoms, and this was the well-known Sea Wolf. And with the Zodiac Sea Wolf 53, which they produce these days, you have a watch which is extremely similar in its proportions and its design to that original classic, except with modern technology and with a general very high quality and high level of build. And so today I'd like to speak about the Sea Wolf 53, except I'm speaking primarily about the newer version with the rectangular hands, because this version incorporates a very interesting movement, and is generally a piece which offers a great deal more technology than you would expect, and a great deal more style than its price would suggest. Of course, the area this watch is aimed at in terms of diving is more of a skin diver sort of arena. It's not designed to be an extreme deep-sea diver, unlike the 1,000-metre dive watches that Zodiac also make. Instead, this is designed to be a nice balance between something wearable every day, but also something with a water resistance high enough for you to be able to happily scuba dive with the watch without any concerns. And so the watch comes in a 40mm stainless steel case which features a beautiful level of polishing on the top of the lugs and brushing on the sides. And thanks to the fact that the brushing is vertical, it slims the case even further and allows it to appear all the more slender and all the more simple on the wrist. However, where you have a relatively simple design to the case with its long sort of lugs and its relatively narrow style, the front of the watch shows a great deal of colour and a great deal of reflections, which is a nice touch on this somewhat vintage-inspired watch, albeit without being overly so. And so on the front of the watch you see a great deal of colour, because the watch comes in a variety of different variants, from the black being the most sedate, to a number of blues, oranges, and even some bright some bright greens and oranges mixed into one single piece. But the beauty of the piece is that you're able to have something with these mineral crystal inserts on the bezel. And the reason for this is that they provide this appearance of acrylic bezels of the past, but with a greater scratch resistance. And of course, thanks to the fact they're mineral, they tend to be able to resist bumps very easily. Then you have a sapphire crystal on the front of the watch which is domed and anti-reflective to allow the front of the watch to be highly legible underwater, but also scratch resistant, which is a nice balance, bearing in mind the fact that this watch is under £1,000. And with this piece it's the details that are interesting, because the dial of the watch is extremely well finished in terms of having these applied indices which either come in a painted finish or in a finish which is simple bare metal, which gives a wonderful reflection. Whilst the outer edge of the dial with the minute and second graduations, you have a coloration depending upon the model, from a subtle off-white colour to a silver or even an orange in some cases. And then one comes to the hands, which on the version I'm talking about has these block-style hands which provide a really wonderful look and balance out the indices extremely well. And whilst this isn't exactly the same as the first 1953 version of this watch, it's still a very interesting design and makes the watch all the more legible and more usable in a modern era. You also have a paddle second hand, which is a nice touch, and again draws from that period of diving, whilst the colours on the dial are extremely well coordinated with the bezel to have a contrasting minute hand on most models, and then of course the bezel, which again matches the colour rather beautifully depending on which version you choose. And the attention detail even goes to the date window, for example, where it's nicely beveled inwards, and one has a date wheel which is matched to the dial colour, which is a very nice touch as well. If you look beyond the caseback of these watches, which is incidentally very nicely decorated with the Zodiac logo, which is deeply embossed, you also find a movement which is rather a curious piece, because it's a movement made by STP, and the Fossil Group owns Zodiac, and they also own STP, which is a Swiss movement manufacturer, and the quality of their movements has been greatly recognised, I think, in recent years, because the movements they make are generally clones of ETA movements, but made to a very different standard. Because the movement which this movement is based on is the STP 1-11. However, in this version it's been upgraded to the STP 3-13. And what this means is it's a movement which is based on the ETO 2824 architecture, but in the case of the 3-13 you get full decoration as well as blued screws throughout, in addition to a swan neck regulator which you don't get on the base STP movement. And what this means is that it has a more fine level of adjustment for the regulation of the watch in order to regulate it very finely and to a very close timekeeping standard. You do also get the advantage of a longer power reserve, because the power reserve on these watches is at least 44 hours, whereas an ETA is 38, and at the same time you do in many cases get longer than that. For example, I, whilst testing one of these STP movements, got in excess of 50 hours, which is quite remarkable for this type of movement, whilst unlike a lot of other movements which have tried to increase their power reserve by dropping the beat rate, this still keeps a nice high beat run. And so when this very interesting movement, beautifully made bezel and case in addition to the dial, with that 200 metre water resistance, plus the fact that this watch has one of the most beautiful bracelets seen at this price range, with a fine link style of Jubilee design, but also with an expandable clasp, you really do get a very, very complete package if you want something interesting, detailed and very luxurious in terms of the features it offers, under the £1,000 mark. Because for £800 the watch comes on the strap, whilst if you stretch to £1,000 you get that full bracelet, which is a really very, very nice touch, and I think makes a nice offering at the lower end of the price range I'm addressing in this video, if you're looking for something interesting and very, very different. Oris is a brand which has often been regarded as something of a more affordable brand in recent years, but in the current situation it's certainly raising its prices to a position where it's able to compete with the likes of higher-end Longines and the lower-end of Omega. And this Oris, being the Big Crown Propilot GMT small seconds, is a very interesting demonstration of the fact that Oris produce very different watches to any other brand. Their concept and their design is not in any way hindered by trying to look back at their history, and instead looks forward in terms of producing something legible, high quality and extremely practical to an owner. And with the Propilot one really is looking at an aviation watch, a pilot's watch, and so at 45mm in stainless steel it is certainly a large piece, but I think represents the concept of a highly legible pilot's watch very, very well, especially in the modern age with the use of a GMT function. The finishing of this case really is a beautiful design, because it doesn't draw from much history in terms of simply being something modern, something crisp and something very carefully conceived. Taking on a very modern form, the whole case is brushed, with this very beautiful, very fine brushing throughout, which means it takes on a very technical sort of form, which gives a great deal of charm in my eyes to the watch, and allows it to take on a very modern aesthetic. This is matched very nicely by the bevels you see running down the edge of the lugs all the way down to the bezel itself, running around the edge of the crystal. And this features this wonderful dual section style of brushing, with the central section being a simple brushed pattern, with the exterior featuring this sort of turbine styling, which is cut into the surface of the metal and matches the crown beautifully. And so this does mimic the jet engines of the modern age, but also gives a slight hint towards something more interesting than simple three-hand Flieger. And of course this is matched by the crown, which is subtly raised from the rest of the case, but still features the same matching turbine finish, and a very sharp but still quite minimalistic form, which I think matches the rest of the watch very, very well, and doesn't draw the eye too much, but still gives a very recognisable form. A subtle but still noticeable feature of the watch is the double-domed anti-reflective sapphire crystal on the front of the watch. And of course, bearing in mind the size of this dial on the watch, one needs a highly anti-reflective, but also highly scratch-resistant crystal, and they found a balance with this sapphire. And one has to bear in mind also that they've only coated the inside of the crystal with anti-reflective coating, and this does have a few benefits, bearing in mind the fact that an external anti-reflective coating, whilst giving the optimal sort of legibility, does scratch very, very easily, and doesn't really help the fact that the sapphire itself is very hard, and so I can understand why Oris went for this setup, because it really is probably the best of both worlds. Then of course one has to bear in mind the fact that this watch is very resistant to the elements, as is that sapphire crystal, because it has a screw-down crown, and of course is water resistant to 100 metres, so you can happily swim with this watch with no concerns whatsoever, though of course diving really isn't an option with a watch which is designed to be a pilot's watch of this sort. But generally the external design of the watch is very simple, but minimalistic enough to draw the eye to that wonderful dial. And being a 45mm watch, the dial is invariably going to draw a great deal of attention. And the dial comes in two variants, with a more conservative option being the black dial, and this features a matte black base with matching matte black elements on the hands, and of course fully white hand tips, which give a very, very legible look to the watch, in addition to those white luminescent markers around the edge of the dial. You also have a GMT hand, which is the same as on the other dial version, however it features a yellow tip, which matches the yellow GMT markings on the dial as well. Then you have a sunken small seconds dial at 9 o'clock, which doesn't cut the indices, in addition to a date window at the 3 o'clock position. If you want something more striking though, then the silver dial might be the option for you. Because whereas the black dial is very much a fully matted dial, the silver version features a wonderful sunburst effect on this slightly warm silver tone that it has. In addition to that, it has a sunburst effect which is separate on the subdial for the seconds, in addition to polished hands as opposed to the painted hands on the black dial version. And this does mean they're not quite as legible or as striking, but it does mean they have a greater luster and match the dial very, very nicely. Otherwise, you still retain the same markings on the rest of the dial with the luminescent markers, in addition to that rehort on the edge of the crystal, as you can see, with the 24-hour markers, except in this case it's brushed to match the dial rather nicely. And of course you also lose the yellow end to that GMT hand in favour of a simple polished hand. Of course what both dials share though is a movement, and this is the Oris caliber 748, which is essentially a Sellita SW220-1, which has been modified by Oris themselves. And so it's a 28 dual movement with an instant date change in addition to small seconds at the 3 o'clock position, which retain the hacking and hand winding of the original movement. It also has the GMT hand, which functions much as it would on an ETA 289 series, but of course this isn't based on that series of movements and so has had to be added on. But altogether it makes a very robust, but also a very serviceable movement, which is a great balance between something different and something new, but also something with an enduring reliability and a durability you would want. And where straps are concerned, to just embellish this watch, you can have a metal bracelet, which is a more luxurious option, and perhaps a more structurally heavy option, or you can go for leather straps, or indeed their rather impressive Cordura straps, which are matched with a very interesting style of aircraft seat buckle, which gives a very interesting look, and something really in line with this watch's design. And so with these specifications and a very distinctive design, I do feel the £1,600 price tag is very reasonable, especially in a world where watch prices are invariably going up. And so you do get a great deal of watch with a design which is truly recognisable and not derivative of anything else on the market, which is something very few brands can say. The next watch I'd like to speak about is a Tudor. And I've spoken about Tudor increasingly in recent months, because I think they're a wonderful way into the luxury market of watches. And I don't simply mean in terms of being a very interesting way into the Rolex ecosystem, whilst they are indeed. I think they're a fantastic way of just getting your head around a really good quality watch, which is a bit different, something a little bit more playful than other options on the market, and with a very wide range of options available, albeit with some versions I'm not too keen on, but nonetheless that's always the case. I think they're very playful, and the quality of their watches certainly is there. And this piece I'd like to speak about today is quite an old model if you look at the models they've released in their range, but one which I think remains an incredibly interesting piece, and one with the real cutting edge of their movements, in terms of features, and in terms of being something really rather clever. Because this is the Tudor North Flag, and it's conceived as the Tudor equivalent of the Rolex Explorer, and it certainly plays that role extremely well in the Tudor range. Because it's a 40mm stainless steel watch with an extremely sharply cut, very contemporary case, which as you can see features brushed finishes throughout, with some polished elements on the bracelet, and a ceramic edge to the bezel. And this is a watch where you get the sense it's been produced with a real care to make it enjoyable to wear, and to give it a real sense of quality in terms of its build, but also to give all the features you would hope for in something genuinely robust and usable every day, and even in quite testing circumstances. Because of course the watch is water resistant to 100 metres, which means it's very, very wearable, whether you're using it in the rain, even swimming, or if you're simply using it on land. But the beauty of this watch is you can use it really anywhere, without any real concern. And this is echoed in the fact that they've added that ceramic ring to the bezel to make it more resilient, and of course the bezel itself protects the sapphire crystal, which is held in place by that brushed surface edge to the bezel. And of course one sees a design which features an integrated bracelet on this watch, and that is harking back to the 70s exploring watches of Tudor, which featured a similar sort of design, albeit a more rounded form. And so you get an element of the heritage of Tudor, but incorporated into something which is thoroughly wearable, but also thoroughly contemporary in terms of its design, with a clean design and a very interesting choice of colours. And this really is a piece where I can't overstate the quality of the finishing. The surface brushing really is phenomenal, with a wonderfully polished crown as well, which is that sort of conical shape to match the shape of the bezel and to echo the forms of the watch itself. And this plays off original forms of Tudor. So, for example, you see that second hand, which is echoed on the Heritage Ranger, and which gives that to that exploration form to the watch, whilst it also has a very similar arrow hand to some of their earlier exploration watches, which does add to the heritage of this timepiece. The dial itself is matte black, as you can see, with this chapter ring which has been raised around the edge of the dial to give these minute markings, with the yellow indices matched at the 5-minute marks with the second hand and with that power reserve indicator. And of course, thanks to the white coloration of the hands, they're very, very legible. And of course, you also have the functions which are shown on either side of the dial. So on the right-hand side, you see the date, and then on the left-hand side, you see a power reserve indicator, which is operated via this rotating ring with the hand painted onto the surface of it, which is a very innovative way of showing it, and something very different to a simple free-floating hand, which allows it to not clutter the dial, but still take up a very legible part. And the movement which is able to allow these functions is also a very interesting piece of Tudor's modern history, because it retains the traditional style of Tudor and Rolex caseback with their proprietary style of opening. However, here, unlike other versions, it has an exhibition caseback, and so through a sapphire crystal you're able to peer their in-house movement, which is the MT5621, which is unseen on any other Tudor model, apart from this piece with that power reserve indicator. And it's a 28 dual movement with which is COSC certified as a chronometer, but also features quite modern technologies such as a balance bridge to provide greater resistance to shocks, in addition to a variable inertia balance wheel, which means it has weights around its edge in the form of screws, which means that it can be set more reliably. And it also has a silicon balance spring for greater accuracy, but also greater resistance to magnetic fields. It runs at 4 Hz, but still is able to give you 70 hours of power reserve, so 3 days, which means you're able to put it down at the start of the weekend, as Tudor says, and pick it up on the Monday morning with no real trouble whatsoever, and the same accuracy and power reserve still remaining. And of course, the beauty of this watch is you can see that on the dial via the indicator. Bearing in mind the fact that this watch doesn't have standard lugs, and so has to take the Tudor bracelet, or one of their straps, or you can have a strap cut to it, but it's not as convenient as changing straps normally. You would expect them to create a really interesting bracelet for this watch, and they certainly haven't disappointed. Because it has a very interesting H-link style of bracelet, which isn't anything like a Rolex Oyster bracelet, for example, which I think is a nice touch, the fact that they've produced something unique for this watch. And the bracelet features these H-links in brushed steel, with polished elements between them to break up the design and really give it a beautiful look. Alternatively, there is a leather strap which is given accents of yellow to match the dial, which is a nice touch as well, and does save you a few pounds if you do choose to go for that, if you're not the sort of bracelet owner. But either way, I think you're getting a really phenomenal timepiece with a very, very varied form of functionality, and with a look which is quintessentially that of Tudor, and something which you won't see very often, as something different to the standard pack of Tudors and Rolexes you'll see, but with a real technology within it, and of course with functionality such as that power reserve indicator which you don't see elsewhere. And the price for this package is £2,570 on the strap, or £2,640 on the bracelet, which will generally be the most common option. But either way, I think is a very interesting and very good value package. Now, the penultimate watch I'd like to speak about is a chronograph from Hanhart. And this is a chronograph which has interested me in terms of its history quite profoundly, because Hanhart were a brand which produced pilots' chronographs in the 1930s and 40s, and which ultimately, due to their designs and the fact that the French military in fact invaded their factory in the Black Forest in Germany, this design really became the benchmark and the base for the Breguet Type 20, and so the continuation of the pilot's watch, making it a really very important design in the history of aviation watches. But the reason I'd like to speak about this watch today is because I think it's a very interesting way into a really very high quality and very luxurious chronograph, with a very interesting piece of technology within it, and design which truly is unique. And so the model I'd like to speak about is the Hanhart Pioneer Twindicator, which features these 2 subdials, one of which features 2 axes, which is a very interesting design and allows the watch to take on greater functionality, but with a more simple design. Now, what I feel one has to bear in mind with these watches is that they are truly handmade products. They're assembled and manufactured by a handful of people with real skills and real ability in Germany. And so one does have to realise these watches are pieces which are very different in terms of the way they're made and the quality of the craftsmanship in terms of the details to a mass-made product. And in terms of the general dimensions of this timepiece, it's 45mm in diameter by 49mm from lug to lug and 16mm thick. And in many ways this is the modern reimagination of those 1930s and 40s pilot's watches. because the watch retains a greatly robust case with a 10 ATM, or rather 100 metre water resistance, with a very large oversized crown, and these pushers, which though not screw down, are pieces which are very robust, and one has that red cap on the bottom pusher in a reinterpretation of the original style of these watches. In many ways, whilst looking at the case of this watch, it's the details that stand out. Because on this version, whereas the more classically correct versions have sharper, more pointed, elongated lugs, this has a greater curve to them, and in many ways a more modern and far more wearable shape. But the details don't stop at this, with beautiful bevels running along the edges of those lugs, and a wonderful quality of brushing which is extremely fine and gives a really very lustrous effect to the watch. Likewise, one has the effect of the pushers, where they're not actually in their conventional places. So one notices that to be traditionally correct, the start and stop chronograph pusher, which is at the top of the crown, is in fact slightly raised, and so isn't in its conventional place, which is a custom change which is made to the movement and the case to accommodate this change. And then of course one notices the Hanhart logo on the crown, which is very deeply cut in, and provides a really wonderful look to the case itself. And then the case back also features a proprietary opening style in the form of a propeller, which is again a lovely touch. And this is in addition to the option of whether you go for a smooth concave bezel, which is brushed, or you can go for a rotating knurled bezel with a red marker, which is again the more traditional touch. To match the intricate detail of the case, one has a crystal which I think rather nicely supports the dial as a highly legible piece, but also gives the watch slightly more soft touch, because one sees a double anti-reflective coated double-domed sapphire crystal, which gives high scratch resistance but also gives you excellent legibility, which again shows the reinterpretation of this design as a modern watch, as opposed to simply being a vintage watch which has been remade, which is a nice touch and shows a great deal of care taken on the part of Hanhart to bring out something interesting and something relevant in the modern age. The dial is another really wonderful element on this watch, because it's been designed to mimic these older styles of Hanhart models, coming in two colours, which is a black, or indeed, if you want something a little bit lighter, a cream. And both offer high legibility with those luminescent numerals, as you can see, and those graduated second markers around the edge of the dial, with the use of Arabic numerals every 5 minutes. Then of course you have two subdials, and these are moved out somewhat to the edges of the dial, because these operate in a slightly different way to other Hanhart versions. So on the right hand side one has the 30-minute counter for the chronograph, but on the left you have two graduations, because you have one hand which runs around the subdial once a minute and is in fact the running second counter, and then around the edge of that in red you have the chronograph 12 hours, and so this provides you with a greater amount of legibility thanks to subdials not cluttering up the dial, but also whilst giving you all of this information and not simply limiting you to a 30-minute chronograph, which is another excellent feature of this watch. One also of course has the two large main hands, being the minutes and the hours, in this cathedral form with a steel style of tone to them, which gives an attractive balance, I think, and offsets the colour of the paint on the dial, but also allows them to look very traditional in their form and be of course very legible at night. And all of this is powered by the Hanhart calibre HAN 4011, and this features a Veljoux base to its form, so it is highly serviceable by Hanhart, but it does feature 35 joules and runs at the same standard 4 Hz. However, the details of this, of course, are the fact that it retains this asymmetrical button placement, where the pushers are placed at these different places on the sides of the case. One also, of course, still retains the 42-hour power reserve of the original movement, but it does give this fantastic double subdial effect, which is a wonderful look and something which is unique to the brand with this particular movement. Then one has a skeletonized Hanhart rotor and decoration on the movement, which is another nice touch and something which really shows the care going into these watches. And so whether you choose to go for this watch on the wonderful riveted leather strap, or a fine link metal bracelet, you're able to get a watch which really rekindles the spirit of early pilot's watches, and allows you to have something of extremely high quality, and something which is fundamentally handmade to an extremely high standard with really beautiful finishing throughout. And so I think, bearing in mind it's a handmade watch to a very, very high standard, I think the price of £3,050 to £3,230 if you go for the bracelet is very reasonable. The final watch in this video is perhaps a strange one to include in a video about alternative watches in the luxury segment under £5,000, because this is a Panerai, and Panerai certainly do get their share of attention. And of course in recent years Panerai have had a few ups and downs, with models such as the PAM 318 being some quite embarrassing flops. However, I feel that the Panerai Radiomir 8 Days is a fantastic way into the brand, but also in many ways the thinking man's Panerai. Of course, at face value, the Radiomir Black Seal 8 Days is in many ways something which you might overlook as simply being any other Panerai. But allow me to explain why I would view this as something quite different, and something which is quite rare to actually see in the wild. Because the vast majority of people who end up buying a Panerai go for a Luminor, as opposed to a Radiomir with the large crown guards and with the fixed lugs, as opposed to the fully built lugs, as opposed to these wire lugs. But this 45mm version of the Radiomir creates a wonderful balance between something you can wear very elegantly and also something that you can wear in a more testing and in many ways a far more difficult circumstance in terms of being 100 metres water resistant and having that large 45mm case. However, with its cushioned form, with those gentle edges and that polished case with that narrow bezel and those wire lugs with that onion crown, you have a very beautiful and in many ways very minimalistic timepiece, which is very elegant as well as being quite robust and rugged. And the other fact which I think is crucial about this watch is the fact that in many ways this is as true as a Panerai can be to its original form. Its dial comes in black. It doesn't have aged luminova on it at all, but rather simply comes with a truly simple, minimalistic and clear design. And the watch does nothing more than it needs to do, with its domed sapphire crystal giving a wonderful reflection onto the dial, and the fact that it just tells the time, or indeed the time and the seconds if you go for the PAM 00609, which is the Black Seal 8 days with the seconds. But either way, you're getting an extremely simple and in many ways very, very symmetrical watch as well, which looks extremely clean and utterly timeless. But the details on the dial are also very telling, because depending upon the version, if you go for the version without the small seconds, you simply get Radiomir Panerai 8 days, whereas if you go for the version with the small seconds, you also get Black Seal on the dial as well. But generally the dial design is very simple, simply with Radiomir and Panerai being the key text. Likewise, you have L Swiss made L at the bottom of the dial, which is a reference to the T used to mark tritium, and indeed the radium markings seen on early watches as well. And this of course fits in very well with the dial, which in this case is a sandwich dial with an upper dial featuring cutouts and then a lower dial featuring a plate of luminova, which is a wonderful difference to a printed dial which you would see on other watches, and really sets this piece apart. Of course, the lugs also provide a really wonderful balance between history, elegance, and also providing a characteristic look. Because rather than having a standard soldered bar as the originals did, these watches have a three-piece sort of bar which slots together and then slots into the case. And whilst it is a tad fiddly to change the strap because you have to unscrew these from the case itself, they do give a fantastic look and something really wonderfully characteristic to these watches. But it's the movement, I feel, with these watches which gives a sort of a balance between modernity, practicality, but also truth to the original piece. Because inside these watches beats the Panerai in-house caliber P5000, which is an in-house movement with 21 jewels and 2 spring barrels. And it's a beautifully decorated piece which runs at 3 Hz, so slightly lower beat rate than for example, an ETA 2824, though this isn't a problem because the version either doesn't come with a second hand or has a small second hand, so you don't really notice it. But it features a Glycodur balance as well as KIF shock protection. But crucially, it has an 8-day power reserve. And of course the movement is exquisitely finished and really is a beautiful piece to look at, with cutouts, wonderfully brushed elements, as well as having beveled and polished plate edges, which are beautiful details, and of course that balance bridge, you do get 192 hours of power reserve. And the crucial element with these watches and these movements is that these were true to the original watches used by Panerai, because the movements they changed to after a few years of using other manually wound movements, which were originally conceived for pocket watches, hence the 9 o'clock seconds, was that these movements were given an 8-day power reserve, and they chose 8-day movements to reduce the wear on the seals around the crown from having to wind the watch up. And so one has a real homage to history here, but also while still providing you with effectively a week's power reserve, giving you a day of overlap time to wind the watch, being an excellent choice for someone who likes to have a manually wound watch, but wants to not have to worry about winding it very often. And so of course, with a price of £4,900 to £5,100 if you go for the version with the small seconds, it is certainly an expensive piece. But I feel with it's a very beautifully made case, and the fact that Panerai really are innovating with their movements in terms of creating something interesting, but also something which has a nice balance of traditional watchmaking beauty and craftsmanship with the features we would now expect in a mechanical watch. I think if you want an alternative watch which will have a nice balance between sport and dress, then this really is a very interesting option, especially for someone who likes classically correct designs and something really unique. And so I'll conclude this video here, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of the video and of my options and choices, bearing in mind the fact that this was designed to be a video about alternative pieces which are different to the standard recommended Omegas, Rolexes, Breitlings and so on, which often tend to fill lists of the best watches under £5,000, making this video slightly different, but I hope interesting. And so do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of it, and if you did enjoy the video then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to enjoy more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.